Hello, and welcome to another edition of Around the Desk from Decision Desk HQ. I'm Drew McCoy, joined today by Dr. Alexander Podcool, and Scott Tranter is with us, it seems.
Hey guys,
Hey, you made it in.
I did.
The social distancing almost got you, but
Yeah,
make it work in the end.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean that's sort of the story of everything right now, right? This the impact of coronavirus on elections and everything else. Obviously, the elections and the primaries are our focus. There are 4 coming up tomorrow. Maybe even before we got into that a little bit, we wanted to talk a little about an announcement we made last week. I think we should probably cover that. Scott, if you want to talk about our decision to not utilize ground staff in these upcoming elections.
yeah. No, I think given the fact that ground staff is one of the three major um, elections results collections methods we use, and that it requires oftentimes people a little bit older interacting with people who are a little bit older for several hours at a time. We figured it's prudent that we, not use several hundred people on the ground going into tomorrow night. And, we're pretty technologically advanced with our scraping and remote monitoring. So we're pretty confident we can pick up the slack. It was interesting to note, it looked like Edison is not doing their exit poll, which is also on the ground. AP's exit poll is not on the ground, so they didn't announce anything. But it'll be interesting to see how the results come out tomorrow night, where everyone is. I think we're pretty good position because we're scraping, but I'm not sure about the others.
Yeah, we tend to not use nearly as many. It's for us, it's much more of an augmentation where there are maybe some areas where that's advantageous to do it, but there are far more areas where we have traditionally used remote processing. So, we wanted to make that decision to be prudent and to take care of people that would work for us and also the election monitors and the election officials themselves. It's really not going to have a huge impact on us, certainly tomorrow night. But that was something we wanted to get out there first thing Friday and make sure everybody understood that we wanted to take those steps. And then really what sort of followed from that was, as you mentioned, Edison saying they're not going to do the exit polling, which really consists of people actually just standing outside of polling places and walking up to somebody and saying, hey, can you take this clipboard and fill something out? Or can I ask you some questions? And obviously that's not the sort of activity that people are really going to be wanting to do, and recommendations are certainly not to do that sort of thing. But then after we made that announcement, we started to see some other things coming out in terms of postponing elections. Now, the 4 Secretary of States in the states that are voting tomorrow, Arizona, Florida, Illinois, and Ohio, announced that they wouldn't be making any changes and that the voting would go on. Again, this was Friday afternoon. Things changed fast, but still no word on any postponement or polling hour changes. What they have done is move some polling locations. So if you live in those states, you may want to check that out because very often they are in nursing homes or other community areas where vulnerable populations might be around, and they obviously want to limit that. So it has had that effect. But beyond that, we are starting to see some changes to voting. Georgia and Louisiana have announced they're pushing their primaries back into April and May. Wyoming is coming up at a certain point with their Democratic caucuses. What they're doing is eliminating the in-person portion of it, so you'll have to vote by mail. It looks like the Puerto Rico Democratic Caucus is going to be primary, rather, is going to be pushed back. That's going to require some legislation, apparently, from the territorial legislature. But they've actually declared a state of emergency and have done some curfews, I think. So the expectation is that would be well within line of their reaction to this. So after tomorrow, we'll probably won't see any voting until early April in large states. And the real question is, does that even happen? The next big one is Wisconsin, and it's not just their presidential, but also their spring primaries. Their state Supreme Court elections are always highly contested and watched. So we'll be seeing if that's going to go forward. But yeah, it's really playing havoc with elections as much as it's playing havoc with everything else. What do you guys think? What are you going to look for tomorrow? I mean, obviously, I think we're going to look at turnout, right? That it's probably going to be down. These are Arizona is a big early voting and mail-in state. Florida has it, but Illinois and Ohio not as much. So maybe we see significantly lower turnout in those two north or Midwestern states.
Yeah, I think that's pretty safe to say that we're definitely going to see much lower turnout in Illinois and Ohio. And as much as I think some of the popular commentary is saying, well, Florida and Arizona might make up for it with the ABEV vote, I still think we're going to start seeing some suppressed turnout numbers there in both of those places, just because people are reacting to this so quickly. Even if we just think of what the news was saying even 3 days ago compared to now, I think people might have been telling themselves a few days ago when they could have turned in their absentee votes or applied for their absentee votes. Now it's just a different ball game, and so people may have started to miss their window for some of these alternative options, and might just be saying, "Well, now it's not worth it to head to the polls." I think one of the things I'm curious in seeing, and considering the decisions from the exit pollsters to not go into the field in some of these places, I'm very curious, I think, to see what the age turnout is going to look like. Are there particularly older people who are going to stay home because of this? And we may get some information from the AP VoteCast exit poll about that. However, this will sort of be a long-term trend where once we start to see what the actual vote rolls say in these states, that'll be able to tell us a little bit about coronavirus's effect on the primary. But I think, yeah, we're looking at turnout in all four of these cases, and so I think places might be a little bit more hesitant to call some races tomorrow night in some of this with considering some of the large variables attached to it. Scott, what do you think about turnout in some of these states tomorrow?
I certainly think we'll see a depression, but not just because of the coronavirus. Because I think most people think, especially on the Democratic side, Biden's going to win. And states like Arizona and Florida are going to have probably 50% ABEV, which means people can mail it in or have already mailed it in. So I think that'll blunt any downturn and turnout. I was talking to someone else today. It looks like Ohio might be close to 20 to 30% ABEV. Illinois could be north of 20%. So it looks like people are finding alternatives to voting. I mean, we'll certainly see. I was looking at Twitter. There's a lot of people thinking that maybe depressed turnout, especially among the elderly, might help Bernie out. It's we'll find out. I guess it wouldn't be the biggest surprise that happened in the last 10 days, but I think these races are pretty much set, and turnout will be lower. But the polling shows that these guys, it looks like it's Biden's to lose.
Yeah, and I think you're right on, especially as we focus on the top of the ticket. But it's also important to note that some of these places
like Dan Lipinski.
Yeah, I think Illinois 3, I think everybody's going to be watching. Dan Lipinski barely survived by the skin of his teeth in 2018 against Marie Newman, and we're on for that rematch this cycle. And if Dan Lipinski's, it's an open primary state, and there was some evidence last time around that that Republicans voting in the Democratic primary might have helped him over the edge in some of the exit poll data that we saw. That is, some Trump supporters in Illinois might have helped push Lipinski over the finish line. If those people are staying home due to some concerns in those Chicago suburbs, then that could be sort of a surprising finding and result out of tomorrow night, where maybe under healthy conditions, that outcome may be a little bit different.
Yeah, that is the main down ballot race that we're watching tomorrow night. There are down ballot races only in two of the states, Illinois and Ohio. Nothing too marquee on the Ohio side, but certainly the Illinois 3 Democratic race is the one that's people are going to watch. And if you're not familiar with it, it's Dan Lipinski is one of the few pro-life Democrats in the House. He's getting primary challenged again from Marie Newman, who has got the backing of the progressive coalitions. So that's a really big race to watch tomorrow night. Beyond that, looking at the presidentials, you see the number of delegates out there. these are just not great states for Bernie Sanders. People looking for a way to see if he can get a path back. I think most people are coming to the conclusion that it's certainly Biden's lead and probably nomination to lose at this point. Sanders in 2016 didn't win any of these states. The closest that he came was in Illinois, which was about a 1.5-point race, and then it went down to between 12 and 16% losses in places like Arizona and Florida. So not exactly the ground that if there was going to be a Bernie comeback, that he and his supporters would certainly want to launch that from. So I think tomorrow people expect this to be a fairly good night for Joe Biden. There was the debate last night. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that, if you watched it at all.
Well, it was certainly a different debate just in terms of the format with no audience and now it being a two-person race. This, in an odd way, almost resembled a general election debate just because it was everybody had their focus 100% on the other side of the podium there. And so I thought it was an interesting race as we sort of saw on some issues, Joe Biden sort of inching leftward, but on some other issues, particularly the Medicare for All debate, him holding strong and even pointing out to Bernie, well, hey, single payer healthcare and Medicare for All is not going to get us out of a mess like this. Just look at Italy. And so I thought it was an interesting ideological clash across multiple issues here. And I guess with that, we could switch over to the national polling. And I'd like to hear both of your thoughts on the debate as well. But to sort of set the stage, going into last night, we saw Joe Biden sort of continuing his upward trajectory. Some polls nationally having him at 60% of the vote share. That's sort of where that average is. The average kind of moves around quite a bit, but sort of a pretty high vote share. Sanders also ticking upward, mostly as a reflection of some of the other candidates dropping out. But I think the piece that we really want to pay attention to here is that separation. The distance between those lines is growing. And again, this just seems like a race that's pretty much over. I guess the question I'll ask both of you, Scott, maybe if you want to take it first, is did Bernie do enough last night in the debate to maybe pivot the conversation? I mean, he's for sure behind in the delegate count in the polling. Did he do enough last night to maybe to start something fresh as we hit maybe the back nine?
Not even close. I mean, the debate was pretty. It wasn't compelling. It was two old guys yelling at each other, and not answering each other's questions. And people lost interest, I would imagine, because they're thinking about other things. I mean, Sanders, I guess, made some points. So did Biden, but I don't remember what they are, and therefore that's why I think Biden maintains the lead.
Yeah, my thing about Sanders in debates has always been he kind of has one speed, because he's an ideological candidate, so he has what he wants to argue for, and he's argued for it for 20 or 30 years, and kind of you're either persuaded or you're not. That's one thing we've seen with Sanders is sort of an inability to build a larger coalition. Although, in fairness, he has done better with younger Hispanic voters, or Hispanic voters, which tend to be younger by definition, than he did, say, in 2016. But really, the ability to build a wider coalition, that's really not sort of how he runs his campaign. He just says we're going to bring new people into it. He's not really trying to persuade people who don't necessarily agree with him or give them sort of an entry point to his campaign. He just says we're going to go to people that haven't participated before. And Joe Biden took a lot of glee in pointing out that while turnout was up, so were his victory margins. So the people that are showing up for Biden, which left Sanders sort of arguing an odd argument, which was, well, they'll show up in the general election. They're not primary voters, which is one, a logistical issue because you don't get to the general if they don't show up in the primary. And B, that's not necessarily the case. We saw in 2016, Hillary Clinton wasn't able to get the kind of voters that Sanders talks about mobilizing that maybe Barack Obama had. So the idea that they would necessarily show up just isn't necessarily a given. And certainly, unless you get out of the primary, it just doesn't matter. So no, I don't think anything changed after last night. It was kind of an odd dynamic, as Scott said, just sort of a lot of yelling. there was two parts to the debate, I think. The first part was talking about coronavirus, where Biden was very much more the executive in waiting. Well, again, Sanders has one speed. He had the ideological argument. And then it sort of went to this weird part where they talked about votes over the last 20 years, which I'm not sure in the midst of a current crisis, people really care about. You know, it's what are you going to do now? What are you going to do tomorrow?
Yeah, and despite those sort of being the two parts of the debate, I think the headline that everybody's waking up to coronavirus-related headlines, and I think maybe the small piece coming out of the debate was essentially Biden vows to select a woman as his vice presidential nominee, and I think despite whatever momentum Bernie was trying to get out of the race, I think Biden sort of just sucked all of the energy out of it with that one line.
Yeah, I guess one of the other interesting exchanges too was when Bernie and Biden were going at each other over super PACs and whether they denounced it. I mean, the takeaway is I really wanted Biden to list the 9. I mean, Bernie called us or like 3 or 2. Yeah. Like but I mean, that just goes to show you, I don't think anyone had any illusions that Biden's a politician and politicians kind of say what they need to say to get ahead. But I think that took a little bit of sheen off of Sanders, because why doesn't he? I mean, he doesn't have 9 supporting him, at least by definition of super PAC, but he does have some. And he, after his 2016 election, he had a 501c4. So, as ideologically pure as Bernie is, I think that was pretty interesting that, he went on the offensive and Biden shot back and Bernie didn't have an answer.
No, see, I thought you were going to go the other way. I thought if Biden had listed one of them, then I think Biden wins that exchange. But Biden totally lost. But he totally collapsed, and so I think Bernie sort of came out of that exchange being like, "Well, go look it up. You deal."
Yeah. No, it was again 2 old guys yelling at each other. He's got it. I mean, Biden didn't finish it. Sanders didn't necessarily convince me. I don't know. It's both these guys just can't finish an argument.
I think one thing that it did remind people of is people had questions about Joe Biden up until 16 days ago. That's how long ago South Carolina was. There were a lot of questions about him, right? And whether or not he was the right person to do it. And then the chips sort of fell into place that, yes, it's going to be Biden. But there were, realistic questions about his ability to prosecute a campaign and to do things. And I don't think those questions went away. I think Mike Bloomberg went away, which is sort of how we got to the point we are. So I do think there were some signs in there that, we don't know obviously how coronavirus and the economic fallout is going to play come November. But I don't know that the idea that Joe Biden is just simply going to steamroll across Donald Trump got a lot of support last night. I think it's going to still be a close race. Again, not entirely understanding how our immediate emergency situation is going to play out. Obviously, that could have a huge impact either way. But yeah, I think maybe some people were reminded that, yes, Biden did well compared to maybe how people feared he was. But I think there were still some weaknesses that a non-Democratic candidate would have the opportunity to exploit. And, we know one thing about Donald Trump is he's not shy about exploiting anything or making some things up to exploit. So I think it's going to be a really interesting race, especially in these uncertain times. Which gives us a chance to look ahead to our forecasting update right now, which, this has changed a lot in, 2.5 weeks. Bernie Sanders falling behind no majority and
it's
Joe
only
Biden.
Been 2.5 weeks.
I said that to somebody yesterday. South Carolina was 15 days ago. Now it's 16 days ago. And Joe Biden was political roadkill at that point.
Yeah. Yeah, I was shorting Joe Biden in all the Super Tuesday states. I don't know. As long as you get out before it happens, gotta play the volatility. That's probably a bad joke to make today. 89% Biden. I don't think I think we all think this is pretty accurate, right?
I think it might be a little low, to be honest. if I was going to have one sort of feel against the data, I would say that's pretty low.
Yeah, I agree. I think also, I mean, if you had said 3 weeks ago that the top 2 candidates on March 16th were going to be Joe Biden or no majority, I don't think anybody necessarily would have believed you. But this is pretty fascinating. Sanders only at 2% for getting the majority. And I'm sorry, if we're going into a contested convention, I don't see Bernie Sanders as being the candidate that all of the virtual delegates rally behind. So I mean, I think tomorrow maybe it'll be even more formally over if all 4 states go in Biden's direction. But we could also start to look at some of these estimated vote shares. For example, in Florida, what we're expecting is Biden to come out with 64% of the vote. I mean, let's say hypothetically, is it just a matter of if Biden wins all 4 tomorrow, we think it's pretty much over? Like, does Sanders need to actually win, or if he runs it close in say 2 of the states, are we in this for a little bit of a longer haul?
Not in practical terms, maybe in
Yeah.
Sanders' mind and that of his supporters. But I mean, seriously, we're well past the strong second place point. He has to win. I think Alex Aldunson had calculated something like 54% of the remaining delegates. These are 2 really big delegate states tomorrow that we're going to see. And so winning a healthy minority share of those delegates does Bernie Sanders nothing. It just doesn't. And I think the only question left is, does Sanders, formally suspend his campaign and concede the nomination? He didn't do it in 2016, where it's a very similar environment right now to what he has now that we've got him heads up again. He has a lead. He's trailing a candidate with a lead that he really can't overcome, but maybe he can drag down to prevent from getting the majority of delegates, and then nothing happens. So the question be, will he really run this out as he did against Hillary Clinton? Might be an interesting dynamic that if he concedes to Joe Biden but didn't to Hillary Clinton, he might come in for some criticism. But on the other hand, it's a different time. We're in emergency situations. We're also, the reality of Bernie Sanders has a different relationship. Apparently, he and Joe Biden actually are friends and have a longer term standing relationship, so he may not want to drag it out. But I kind of think that's the question that we're going to be faced with on Wednesday is where does Bernie go? And especially in these times where what do you do to change something, right? Probably not going to be any more debates. You can't go campaign in any sort of traditional sense. So what's going to change here? And you have to then win 65% of the remaining delegates. The math and the realities just are going to be stark probably come Wednesday.
Yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot more left to say about this. I mean, I guess I don't know if anyone addressed it yet, but obviously Bernie doesn't have a chance, but doesn't mean he can't stick around to the convention. What do we think that the chance of that is?
I mean, I was on the record last week saying I thought it was a pretty low chance that he would stick around through the convention. And I think my argument there is mostly that I think he already played the card in 2016 that he's going to try and inch the party leftward in terms of getting particular policies within the platform, trying to influence nomination rules in the future contests and that sort of thing. So I just don't know how much political capital he has within the DNC structure to reap anything useful out of staying in the contest until the convention. But maybe you two have different thoughts on that.
I also think when a candidate gets out, they want to get out on a high note. As we saw after South Carolina, the rationale was, hey, we need to rally around. This needs to become, Joe Biden's time. So everybody that quit got a sort of a pat on the back after Super Tuesday, or the ones before, right around then. It's like, okay, great, thanks, you ran a race, good job, you did the right thing at the right time. I think Sanders would have that opportunity now, and he could say, listen, I dragged it out to 2016. As you point out, Podcool, I got a lot of these concessions in terms of what happened, and now we're in an emergency situation. Donald Trump's terrible, blah blah blah. So we need to rally around and accept, that Joe Biden's the nominee, and he'll get a moment. If he drags it out until the the convention, he doesn't get anything. He doesn't get a speaking slot. He doesn't get anything. Now he gets a moment. He gets a pat on the back. He gets to, to say, hey, you did a good job and you're one of us, and it's all nice.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Scott, do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean that would be the gracious way to go out. We'll see though. We will see. I mean, all intents and purposes, Wednesday he should be giving a dropout speech in Vermont, but we'll see. We'll see. Yeah. I guess the only interesting thing was it was brought up on the Sunday morning shows yesterday, and Chris Wallace's show. I believe one of the guests brought it up on Meet the Press. Is, all three of these guys are in their 70s: Trump, Biden, and Sanders. What does the coronavirus and their inability to, they can't travel, or if they might get it, that kind of stuff, how that would affect some of the campaigning and things like that. And if you're Sanders, not that you're hoping Joe Biden gets it, but you just want to see how the next 3 to 6 months goes, and, maybe suspend your campaign and or actively or quietly campaign, just stay in it to see what happens. That would be the only thing I could think Sanders would be thinking. And it's not like he's going to get up in front of a podium and say that's what he's waiting for. But you got to be in it to win it, and he might want to stay in it for that reason.
Well, on that
Rosie
that encapsulation of the moment we are in.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to do it for this edition of Around the Desk. Please like, favorite, or do whatever is appropriate on your favorite streaming platform. Yeah, we will have the results tomorrow. Are we live streaming tomorrow night? I don't remember.
I believe we are.
We are live streaming tomorrow night. There you go. You've learned it as I've learned it. So we will be on for these 4 states, potentially for the last really big night of the 2020 Democratic primary fight. So please join us. We'll be back Wednesday with a wrap-up show on that. And given the way things are going, I'm sure things will look very different in 48 hours than they look now. That's about the only thing we know for sure, is that things are going to look very different very soon. Until then, thanks for joining us. I'm Drew McCoy. That was also Scott Tranter and Dr. Alexander Podkul, and we will see you again soon around the desk.